Hi, I'm Star Parker. A focus on race I'm going to talk about today on urbancure.org. The brutal death of George Floyd at the hand of a police officer has our whole nation once again focused on race, the great burden of America's founding. God established a unique place in history for America as a nation to pursue truth. History proves that her founders recognized this special call and thus declared her founding documents that all men are created equal. Yet, at her founding, 20% of people were slaves. The politicians of that time heavily debated this dilemma, but then concluded to push the problem into a future date. Thus, the burden of race has stayed with us since the beginning of our nation as Americans. A civil war, a civil rights act, a political movement that moved us away from the founding principles of limited government and equal protection under the law towards new systems of government intervention on every question of race, racism, and racial inequalities. Today in 2020, quest and passions on this founding burden of race have escalated to become between those who think America is inherently evil, and thus all of our systems need to be destroyed and transformed, and those who think America is inherently good, and thus her systems need to be fine-tuned towards better over time. Questions regarding the political movement toward new systems of government interventions have arisen since most of them were established in the 70s. And today, I'd like to explore the government intervention programs of affirmative action and racial preferences. I would argue that the premise of debate should not be the founding principles, but the implementation of these principles, a pursuit of truth to build a more perfect union. So let's take a look inside the government intervention programs with my very special guest, with our intent to discover some truth. My expert guest today is Mrs. Carol M. Allen, a research specialist, most recently at the Michigan State University. Ms. Allen is a published author and has written extensively on issues of higher education, literacy, cooperative library collections development, and library systems implementation. In 2008, she wrote a book called Ending Racial Preferences, a research tome about her experiences and the debate surrounding the Michigan story to dismantle its racial preference programs in public contracting, education, and employment. I'd like for you to welcome with me Mrs. Allen. Welcome, Carol. It's very nice to see you today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Who would think that we would be talking about questions that you were raising and trying to find answers to now almost 20 years ago, just with the battle in Michigan? Tell us a little bit about how you developed the passion to say something's gone wrong here. We need to address issues of racial preferences to lead you then to write such a significant book for today.
Well, I have an interesting story to tell, I think, from a certain point of view, because for most of my life, I was very much a liberal advocate of affirmative action. When I was at the University of Virginia, I even co-chaired the college's committee on affirmative action. But my eyes were opened, in all honesty, through the teaching of my husband and mentor, William Allen. And through him, I was able to come to understand that what I think many people felt was a system that began with good intention had not worked out at all the way that it was hoped for, and was having actually perverse negative impact on the very people that in theory it had been set up to help.
Now, where did you grow up that you developed those ideas to think that this was a help? You know, why would you have gravitated toward affirmative action programs being a solution to some of the racial questions of that time in the first place?
In part, I think it's just, I grew up in Baltimore.
Okay.
I grew up largely living in an entirely white environment. And I don't really know exactly why, but I believe probably it was my Catholic upbringing that led me always to feel a great deal of sympathy and empathy toward racial injustice. but I did not have the right intellectual lens to understand really how that injustice works. And so that's where my learning under Dr. William Allen, husband William Allen, ended up really opening my eyes and helping me to see that what looked just, what looked to be helpful, was actually sending a very powerful message that you need help.
Right.
You can't do this on your own. And it was like a light bulb went off for me.
Well, that's exciting because I think it's a moment in time that we need to revisit, because there were many that were saying, even coming up out of slavery, that we don't need this extra special attention. We're human too. Let's just remove the barriers so that we can live free. So I want to ask you a few questions about race, rage, what we're seeing today, this extra focus, because I believe that during the civil rights movement, there were great opportunities to focus on the human being, to not go into the government intervention programs that we started to see in the 70s. And I think that maybe we got lost there a little bit. So I want to ask you some specific questions and elaborate where you feel you need to. But race and rage are in the headlines again, and some have inferred that much of the anger in the streets is a result of what students have been learning in higher education. So tell us about the modern day racial preference programs and the role that they might play in some of the emphasis on race that we are experiencing this particular summer of 2020, 56 years after the Civil Rights Act was signed into law.
Well, I think there are really two components, Star. Part of it is the harm that's done strictly by the racial preferences themselves. It sets up a concept of other, and as I was saying before, it sets up a concept of victim might be too strong, although I think that it's so widespread it begins to take on that sensibility a little bit. But
Well,
it
let's
just sends
explore
a
other
powerful
then.
negative message.
Yeah, let's explore other. Then if we say victim might be a little too strong, elaborate what you mean when you say other.
Call me naive, call me optimistic, but I really believe that it is possible for us to see color and not see difference.
Wow.
But I feel that what is done through the preference programs and the diversity programs, so I think these two working together, just completely emphasizes other, different, not the same, and we lose sight of our common humanity. And that is what ultimately is going to save us, if we are to be saved, is our understanding of common humanity.
Wow. Well, that's beautiful. And I think a lot of people aren't even understanding or appreciating just how embedded these programs are in our society. So I want to ask you, what is affirmative action? We hear about these programs in public contracting, education, and employment. We heard that the Supreme Court landmark case in 2003 affirmed these affirmative action programs in student admissions. Tell us what you know about this court decision and the impact colleges and now corporations and the decisions that they're making regarding race today.
I had a wonderful opportunity when I wrote the book to do a lot of research on the origin of affirmative action, and that's why I still feel that at the very onset it was a good intention.
Okay.
That there was no notion of quotas. In fact, there was a lot of work done to emphasize that quotas are wrong and not the way to go. Nevertheless, it sort of began to creep in, and it ended up at times even meaning that extra points were given on the basis of race. And that ended up causing, of course, someone like Barbara Gruder or Jennifer Gratz, who were denied admission on the basis of race, to feel that they were experiencing a sort of discrimination, reverse discrimination themselves.
Yeah.
But so I think that the original intent was worthy, reasonable.
What was that original intent that you
execution
think
not.
was worthy, or when you think about one of the business gurus, McCoby, said that there are many great movements, and some movements have great leaders, and the movement may be necessary, but at a certain point, the movement can become a business, and then the business can become a racket. And I think that when we look at the quota programs, we're probably at the racket stage, but the business stage we have to question. And so on your premise that there maybe was a good intention coming out of a civil rights movement, do you find that the Civil Rights Act was not enough to solve the problems and allow for America just to mature into that new day? Or did you feel that government needed some type of intervention with these affirmative action programs?
Hard to look back and say, what if? You know, how might it have been done differently and turned out differently? But my sense is that, as you were saying, the business even turned into a racket. And I think that where the wrong turn happened was when it just became so systematic, so widespread. But I think there was always at least one underlying flaw, which is that it's really peculiar to think about ending racial discrimination by practicing racial discrimination. Right. And so had affirmative action taken a different approach and merely looked not so much at race, but at educational background, economic background, and opened the doors to college more widely to admit people with the notion that it's the vehicle for opportunity, right. Admit more widely, and then see how people do.
Well, we've seen some of that action and activity of late, mostly in Texas comes to mind, because they began to say, wait, let's just look at the bottom 10% and allow them access to opportunity. It's not their fault necessarily that they go to a broken high school. We will try to fix that later and with different opportunities or solutions, but we need to allow access into college. And so we're seeing some of that activity over the last couple of years, 10 years maybe at the max, but you and your Michigan project perhaps helped move that along. I'm understanding now California may be even reversing to reverse what it did. It tried to take away the affirmative action programs and say, let's just look at merit and let's see if we can get to your point, income disparities, and perhaps if people don't have access to quality education, but beyond race, but they want to go backwards. So tell us a little bit about what happened in Michigan, what led you to drive that or become a part of making Michigan refocus itself away from race and maybe focus on some of these other factors that might keep kids lingering behind.
The work that we did as an organization toward a Fair Michigan with regard to the Michigan Civil Rights Initiative was really focused not so much on advocating specifically for the Michigan Civil Rights Initiative as it was providing people an opportunity to really learn what it was about. Okay. At that point, no one was using the term misinformation quite so much as it's used nowadays.
Or fake news.
Or fake
like
news.
Now we have it even more than the soundbite, but you're right. There was a lot of misinformation out there.
But it was being practiced.
Yes, it was.
It was being practiced very actively. And it was ironic because as I saw it, and I'm a librarian by training, so I think I have some ability to sort of look at a situation, read material, differentiate facts from misinformation. The folks who were initiating the Michigan Civil Rights Initiative, they were accused of misinformation. But in fact, the group who was perpetuating the misinformation were those who were mischaracterizing the intent of the MCRI. The many colleges and universities, the business community, the government, they all really distorted the intent. And so we felt that it was important to just provide some vehicle somewhere for individual citizens to hear a good, honest debate, hear the merits of racial preferences, and here are the reasons why racial preferences cause harm, and then decide for themselves what did they think was correct once they had a chance to hear good arguments on both sides. And so that was really the main work that we undertook. We did undertake it with some degree of confidence that if people had that chance, they would see the problem with the way affirmative action was currently being used, particularly in higher education, and would vote against it, and that's just what they did.
You did indeed, but now we're starting to see this same notion rear its ugly head again, as if African Americans can't compete, as if there's something handicapping to keep them from the same starting point, or even to have to work harder if they come from circumstances that did not avail them to the opportunities that others may have. We hear all the time, whether that one gets a computer, this one has a home with both a mom and a dad, and they're actually making even videos to say that the poor Black has to have this helping hand. And we're starting now to have this discussion again. What do you think needs to be done to make sure that the affirmative action, racial preference debate is in the forefront of the discussions we're having today about race, so that we don't go down that path again after so much work has been done to try to dismantle this heavy focus on race?
Well, I would make the case, Star, that I think it was not dismantled. I think it just went underground in those states, those handful of states where initiatives similar to the MCRI were passed. So you have California you have Washington, you have Michigan, and something a little bit along those lines, not quite the same in Florida. And my sense is that it just went underground.
Okay.
And the practices continue at a more subtle and more nuanced way. And the intention behind it of you need a helping hand and we're going to give you a helping hand is being still flourishing and still communicating that very negative message, both to the non-Black community and to the Black community. Right. And it's a very invidious message.
Yeah, it gets to where I interrupted you a bit to get to the victim part that now so many are buying into. Our youth are coming out of school with this idea that they cannot compete. They are not even trying to compete. In fact, one of my dear friends asked me once why American Black parents tell their children they're poor. He said, in our country, it's such a cruel thing to be and to and you want out of. So why would you even bring that up with your children? I think that we should discuss this idea of I'm a victim that is now keeping us entrenched in these programs and keeping them alive. Do you have any thoughts about how can we move not just the infrastructure? If you ask about systematic racism, I think that this is where we can find some, that where we have put it in our colleges as well as our corporations, but not just from the side of society, but from the individual. How do they break through all of this noise that you're a victim? You cannot compete without these programs.
I sure wish I had a simple solution to offer. I think it's going to just take a lot of work by those few rare and brave individuals like yourself and organizations like CURE who are communicating a different message. And my prayer really is that bit by bit, more people will have their eyes opened and come to see the true implications and how damaging to an individual's sense of self-worth and self-confidence these messages are, and the harm that it does in creating a wall between people.
Right.
We should be wanting to tear walls down, not build walls up.
Right.
Except, of course, on certain border situations.
Oh, well, that might be true too. Right. That's
but when it comes to human to human,
yes.
you know, we need to tear down those walls and barriers.
Well, I'm wondering if that's possible for the individuals to gravitate toward messages. I appreciate the compliment to CURE and those of us that are trying to make a difference in a small way. way. Can that be done without undoing these programs? I mean, we have to, it seems like society should say, we're not going to do this anymore so that we can help the individual along.
You know, I hadn't thought about it in quite this way, Star, but just a little light bulb went off for me just right this very minute. So at the moment, what is happening with not so much the protests, but with the riots, but to some extent with the protests, they want to completely remake the American system,
right.
the American society, the American government. And that is what is needed, but not remaking it the way that they have intended,
right.
which is to declare, as you were saying, that everything is wrong
right.
and needs to just be smashed and rebuilt. I think what we need to do much more is get back to our roots,
right.
understand the problem that was at the root, which was a real problem,
right.
and look for a different way to solve that problem.
Right.
I wish I knew for sure what that way was. I don't, except that I think we mustn't give up hope
right.
that it is possible for change to come about. And I'll give a good example. It's one drawn very much from my personal life. So I have a cousin, college-educated woman. Her husband's college-educated. He was sort of on a path to become a professor and took a slightly different tact and became a writer working for the federal government. They live in Colombia, and they are sort of like the very image of white liberals. They have recently had their eyes opened by an experience that they're having at the Universalist Unitarian church that they attend, where the message is being given that all whites are fundamentally racist.
Right.
And there's a minister, his name is escaping me right at the moment, with the broad Universal Unitarian Church, who's written a book saying we're being shut down and told you cannot think what you think. And if there's anything that Unitarians stand for, it's freedom of thought.
So they're contradicting themselves buying into this,
right.
this idea of white privilege. You got to believe it. You are. You're privileged. Yes, you are.
Or else. And his book has been banned.
Oh wow.
He's been rejected by his church.
Okay.
And so my cousin and her husband are suddenly saying, wait a minute. This isn't right.
Wow.
This isn't right. And it may be that it has to get to that level of a direct personal experience that suddenly breaks through to your comprehension and helps you to see that something is really amiss here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that this moment may allow for that. There is a danger in what we're seeing over the last few weeks since the death of George Floyd, but there's also an opportunity in the middle of this crisis, and that guilt that everyone is feeling, that remorse that they're feeling, that grief that they're feeling is their own. And so perhaps we will begin to examine ourselves. Last week I had to tell one of my guilt-ridden friends of 20 years that I reject this feeling of guilt. I reject that he's going to feel guilt. I reject this. I refuse to become his black friend. I'm like, we've been knowing each other too long. I'm not going to be your black friend. I am not going to be forced to look at racism and look for racism behind every white person I encounter. Do I have to start with those that are in my family? I've known them forever. And now all of a sudden I have to pretend that there's something inherently inside of them that's evil that it's my duty to purge and purge through law. I told him I don't want his grandchildren being taught to look at my blackness as some type of handicap. I just straight out told him this, but I want to know then where do we go from here? Is there a point of ceasefire in the discussions that we're having? Is it going to have to be each individual uniquely, or is it going to have to be corporate, that we say at the same time that we are individually checking ourselves, that we can look at some of the systematic approaches that we've taken to race questions, whether it's affirmative action, racial preferences, and do something societal about dismantling them? Is it a combination of both, like driving a stick shift car? At the same time you're pressing the gas, you lift off the clutch. Where do we go? What next?
I think the solution will have to lie in a combination of the two. But what will trigger that? What will make it possible? And I can only pray that there will be a handful of brilliant, brave people. I'll boast a little bit on my husband, who I consider to be both, who will speak the truth so cogently that finally people will begin to hear it. And so I think the changes in individual people's awareness is going to have to precede changes in the systems. And that looks to me like the only thing that's going to change the systems is the people. But most days I'm not very optimistic. I'm afraid I have to say that. But every now and again I have a ray of hope.
Well, your cousins give us hope, because now they're looking at it a little bit differently, and maybe some of the students that were in the streets over the last few weeks, as they go home and get in their comfortable beds and look out at the communities that they ruined and the death that occurred as a result of this one place in time where the whole nation came together to grief, watching this vivid incident. I think there is hope that we can gain from this. So we're going to look for it. We're going to pursue truth. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for talking with me.
Well, freedom is at stake when you think about government intervention programs, when we think about how our lives touch in the public square. So let's continue the dialogue, a focus on race. Let's continue to look at government intervention programs since the 60s, when we came to the conclusion that we needed a Civil Rights Act so that men could live free. The African American men at that time could live free. Let's see if that can result in this free country of ours as a result of us dismantling some of these programs on affirmative action and racial preferences. Next week, we'll probably be looking at other government intervention programs similar to welfare programs, the Great Society itself, and the war on poverty. I'm Star Parker. Thank you for joining me.